All right, so we'll get started. So hello again, everybody, and welcome back. This is part two of our three-part webinar series with Child Trends, Understanding Trauma and Fostering Resilience when Working with Afghan Refugee Students and Their Families. We are joined again by our colleagues at Child Trends, Dr. Brandon Stratford and Cassidy Guros, who will be leading our learning today. This time with a session focused on helping students and families feel seen and heard, and specifically focusing on understanding the impacts of the migration process. And so thank you again, everyone, for attending. I know some of you, we were just chatting before you all arrived that today is some of your Friday, that you are off tomorrow. And so have a great day off tomorrow. And so thank you for joining us, even if you are kind of starting your long weekend with us today. So thank you again. And thank you to Brandon and Cassidy for your expertise. You all can take it away.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. We are excited to join you once again. We don't have tomorrow off, but again, hopefully y'all have good plans to rest up over a long weekend for those of you who are off. I'll just do a really brief introduction myself in case anybody is here who wasn't here last time. But basically, my story is that I started off with getting my bachelor's degree in elementary education. Then I went into the Peace Corps and worked in a rural part of Paraguay for a couple of years with educators there. I came back and worked briefly as a math and reading specialist in Seattle and realized what I really wanted to focus on was the social and emotional challenges that students were coming to school with. So I went back to school and got my master's in social work. Then I worked and I went to the University of Maryland. So I came out to the East Coast. And then I worked in community settings as well as in school-based settings in elementary school and middle school. And then I went back and got my PhD in public health because I wanted to be able to kind of look at things from a more policy and programmatic lens, and kind of help school districts and other organizations use data and really think about how to best meet the needs of students, staff, and families. And I'll turn it over to Cassidy for her intro.
Thanks, Brandon. And hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all again. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, hi. I'll keep this brief. My name is Cassidy Guros. I'm a policy analyst on the education and youth development teams at Child Trends. And there I'm really focused on promoting safe and supportive environments for youth, that kind of thing. So just really excited to be here with you all today and to continue what we built upon during the last session. So really briefly, I'll just say a little bit more about Child Trends. Child Trends is a national nonpartisan research organization with experts in early childhood, child welfare, healthy schools, juvenile justice, mental health, and youth development, just to name a few. This slide summarizes some of our education work that Brandon and I work on, but you can scan the QR code in that top right-hand corner if you're interested in learning more. And also, you'll see our emails at the end of the presentation, but always feel free to reach out to Brandon or myself. Okay, so we already had people introducing themselves in the chat, but we'd love it if you could all take a moment and just pop your name, pronouns, role, location, and most importantly, something that you did over the last week to provide trauma-informed support to refugee students and their families. This could be something you engaged in directly with a student or family, but it could also be something that you did to increase your own knowledge or educate others in your school or organization. So I'll give you a moment to think about that and enter that in the chat while we move on with the rest of our housekeeping items. Okay, so as Megan said, this webinar is the second in a three-part series. We'll go over more about what we talked about in the last session in a moment, but generally we just gave an overview of trauma, adversity, and resilience. Today we're going to focus on how our identities and experiences can influence work with refugee students and families. It's important that this training goes beyond understanding the experiences of students and their families, but also understanding how our own experiences, beliefs, and backgrounds influence the way we see and interact with the world around us. So there will be some opportunities to engage in some self-reflection today and to share your own thoughts with the group. And just remember that sharing with the group is entirely optional. We do want to give you a heads up that today is going to might feel a little bit more personal, and we'll wrap today by spending some time examining how the refugee experience can influence the identities of students and families in order to better equip us to ensure that students and families we work with feel seen and heard. And then our last session next week will focus on ways that schools can support positive mental health for refugee students. We'll cover some best practices at an organizational level and also have time for you all to share some things that you're seeing or maybe wish to see in your own communities. And we're hoping that this session is going to be really interactive with a lot of audience participation. So stick around for that next week. Okay. Hopefully this doesn't look too unfamiliar either. These are the group commitments we went over last time. And just very briefly, I'll draw your attention to the image at the bottom once again. This illustrates the key elements of a trauma-informed approach. And specifically in designing group commitments, we really want to build a strong foundation for trustworthiness and transparency, as well as collaboration and mutuality. So just as a brief reminder, commitment 1 is to encourage folks to engage. Engagement allows us to develop deep collaboration toward a common goal of learning and also promotes peer support. And the request is to participate as much as you're able, just to serve as a reminder that there might be times where folks might not participate for a variety of reasons, which may include needing to take a pause due to strong personal reactions to something that's been shared. And as we mentioned earlier, today might feel a bit more personal as we talk about our identities. So to that end, please know that we're not asking you to disclose any information today beyond what you feel comfortable sharing. And commitment 2 is a reminder to respect the diversity within the group. This is intended to help us establish a sense of safety while also calling on us to recall that there are many issues related to power and oppression that can influence our experiences as humans and as professionals working with students and their families. It's also a reminder that this space is intended to empower us to share experiences, learn from each other, and choose how to best apply what we learn in our communities. And finally, just want to remind everyone that the session is being recorded so that others can benefit from it in the future. So again, just keep that in mind as you consider what you might want to share today. And again, please do take space for yourself as needed. Okay, and here are our session objectives for today. It's a little preview about what we'll be talking about. So first, we'll discuss the ways in which refugee students and families' identities may be influenced by their refugee experience. We'll also talk about how our own identities and experiences may influence our work with refugee students and families. And last, we'll describe the concept of secondary traumatic stress and identify some strategies to manage that. Okay, we're going to quickly, briefly recap the material that we covered during the last session for those that might have missed it or just need a refresher. Like we said, this is some people's Friday, so I feel that Friday. We discussed the definition of trauma that's widely used by SAMHSA, which is the definition, which is that, trauma is an event or series of events experienced as physically or emotionally harmful that has lasting effects. We also talked about the difference between trauma and adversity, mainly that experiencing adversity doesn't necessarily result in trauma, especially when supportive buffers are present. And we also discussed the body's stress response system and how stress can negatively impact physical and mental health, even if it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of trauma. And we also discussed the concept of resilience and really wanted to emphasize that resilience is not just a characteristic that individuals have, and that a supportive environment is really a part of building resilience as well. We then put everything we learned together in the image to the right to understand how refugee youth and their families might be impacted by stressors related to their migration experience, which, like I said, is illustrated by that bucket. And we talked a lot about the experiences of refugee students and their families. Hopefully that really emphasized and empowered you all to realize the importance, your importance as potential supportive buffers in mitigating experiences of trauma. And now today, we're going to shift the focus further onto us, our role as educators, and more importantly, the identities we carry with us and how that impact how we view the world and interact with the world.
Okay, so thanks, Cassidy, for getting us started. As Cassidy mentioned, we're going to talk about identity and how identities of refugee students and their families may be influenced by migration stressors. And I want to introduce you to Samira. Samira is is a real person, but she is not a real person in this activity that we're going to be doing. This is a photo, but we're going to use her in this exercise to help us start thinking about the role of identities in the lives of refugee students. So I want you to imagine that Samira shows up to her first day of school in your community. And we can go to the next slide, I think. Yep. So it's natural for people, go back, sorry. It's natural for people to make pretty quick assessments when meeting someone for the first time. So we're going to pause and take a moment to consider which identities might people assume are true of Samira. So I want you to just take a moment, pop them in the chat, or just think about them. But just consider, if Samira is showing up to your school for her first day, and people are meeting her, what are some of the identities that people might think she holds? All right, I'm gonna give it just a couple more seconds. I know people must be furiously typing away. Muslim, female, they might assume she's a non-English speaker, girl, newcomer. Okay, people might assume that she doesn't speak English. They might assume that she might be a quiet person. So feel free to keep them coming. But one of the points that I want to make sure to point out here is that folks are sharing multiple identities, right? Because we all have more than one identity. And that is an important thing to keep in mind as we talk about the role of identity for refugee students, as well as for ourselves. So when we're talking about identities, there are kind of two big categories. The first category is social identity. So social identities are how we see ourselves in relationship to others. So for example, Samira may identify as Muslim, which many of you also said. And because she's wearing a headscarf, others might also see her that way. But she might also identify as a member of the LGBTQ community, which I don't think I saw anybody mention. And it's possible that when people are first meeting her, they might not guess that about her. The second category is personal identity. So personal identity is less about how we see ourselves with others and just more kind of about what we know is true about ourselves. So for example, Samira might identify as someone who loves science or someone who loves playing video games. But it's important to keep in mind that we rarely know all the identities that students and their families hold. And in fact, it's pretty easy for us to assume that they do or don't hold certain identities, even when we don't really know that much about them. For example, we all made some guesses about what identities she might hold just by seeing a photo. So we're going to talk more about that and kind of the assumptions that people might make. But for now, just keep in mind this concept that we really do hold many different identities. And that's going to be key for us thinking about how identities might influence ourselves as well as the students and families we work with. So in addition to having multiple identities, it's also important to keep in mind that identities can change over time. And in fact, adolescence is a key developmental period for forming different aspects of our identities. But you can also teach an old dog new tricks. So identities can change for adults too. For example, becoming a parent or changing careers might shift how you see yourself in some respects. So some things may stay the same and other things may shift over time. And finally, because we do have so many identities, particular aspects of our identities will be more or less central in different situations. So if we think about Samira, for example, her identity as Muslim may feel less central to her when she's taking a math test, but more central when she's thinking about how she's going to explain to her new friends why she isn't eating lunch during Ramadan. So again, it's important to keep in mind that identities that we hold aren't always as central in every circumstance and in every kind of group of people. The centrality of our identities may change. And I just mentioned that adolescence is an important time for forming identities, which I'm sure all of you know since you work in schools. But that normal developmental process can get complicated for refugee students. So a big task for adolescents is really figuring out who they are in relationship to others. And as we all remember, that's a pretty complicated process, even in the best of circumstances. But imagine what it's like when you're not fluent in the language that most people in your community speak, or when there are unwritten social norms that you aren't aware of. So the text on this slide comes from a research article about acculturation, identity distress, and internalizing symptoms among refugee youth. And it really helps to kind of put some description to the process that refugee students might be experiencing when it comes to identity formation. And I want you to focus on the purple, which I will read. And it says, a resettled refugee adolescent frequently must reconstruct their sense of self while simultaneously responding to the adaptive demands of adjusting to life in their host country. So not only are they kind of figuring out who they are, but in many cases, they're refiguring that out because, as we just mentioned, social identities really are about how we are related to other people. And now that you're in a new setting where people have different expectations and norms and customs, you're kind of refiguring out who you are while you're also trying to figure out just like, not only who am I, but how do I function? How do I take the bus? How do I get to school? How does all this work? So it's a lot, right? So let's unpack it just a little bit on this next slide. So if you joined us last time, you may remember my little haunted house metaphor about our stress response, because I like metaphors to help me apply concepts to real life. So today we're going to use a game of Jenga to think about the process of identity formation for refugee youth. Hopefully everybody's familiar with Jenga, but basically you have this stack of blocks. They're all neatly stacked. And then you have to start pulling them out and then putting it back on top. So you're reforming this tower. So we're going to imagine that playing the game of Jenga represents the process of identity formation. And the blocks are getting shifted as identities are getting established and changed. And if you're like me, when you play Jenga, you might tug and push at the blocks just a little bit to kind of test them out and see, is this the one that I want to pull out before you really commit to making a move. So now imagine that the tower tumbles and you have to start all over again. But this time, all of a sudden, most of the players in the game have been switched out. So you're not playing with the same people anymore. And they also seem to be playing by slightly different rules than the ones you learned. So just imagine yourself playing this game and how stressful and frustrating that game would probably be compared to playing it previously where it was all people you knew and you seemed to know all the rules. And now add on top of that in this new game, you might also have trouble communicating with the other players because you might not speak the same language. So on the next couple of slides, we'll review some additional considerations as we think more about how we as adults working with students and families can be supportive. So hopefully that example was useful to you. Now, I want to move on to this slide where we focus on some protective factors. So research suggests that having strong ties to previous cultural identities is associated with better outcomes for migrant and refugee youth. So being able to stay connected to who they previously were and to those kind of cultural and maybe religious identities that were meaningful to them, being able to hold on to that is associated with better outcomes in general. Refugee youth who feel integrated within their new community also tend to have better outcomes. So the key here really is to help refugee students maintain both positive connections with cultural identities that they held in the past, while also building a sense of belonging in their new community. So it's quite a balancing act. And as you can see in the image that's here on the slide, I picked this one for a reason, because it's not just one balance, there's a lot happening. So keep in mind that, these processes of feeling belonging while also maintaining who you were and what was important to you, those are important things. And we as the adults in schools should really be kind of thinking about ways that we can support that. And another really key piece, again, probably shouldn't be a surprise because we've been talking about social identities, is positive relationships. So positive relationships really play a key role when it comes to identity formation. As we mentioned before, social identities focus on how we see ourselves in relationship to others. So being able to form supportive relationships with peers and adults in our new community and school really is kind of the foundation for us to be able to explore our identities and our social identities, because it really requires us to feel safe and comfortable exploring those identities with these people. So on the next slide, we'll see that while there are important protective factors, there's also experiences that can complicate the work of forming and reforming identities for refugee students. For example, I'm sure anybody who's worked with immigrant students at all realizes that it's pretty common for youth to learn a new language or pick up on new cultural norms more quickly than their parents. And as a result, they may be placed in a position to play a role as a culture or a language broker, where they're trying to help their parents understand language, or even kind of giving cues of what they've learned is appropriate or not appropriate, which I'm sure all parents of teenagers have experienced, whether your child is an immigrant or not. Kids like to kind of remind us when we're stepping outside of the bounds of what they think is appropriate, but that can be a particularly stressful situation for refugee youth, because it often exposes them to adult situations, such as conversations about medical care for family members. They might become involved in discussions about financial stressors, housing, legal status of family members, because they are there to help translate. And being exposed to all those conversations can really create a lot of anxiety for refugee youth. And for adolescents, it can also feel really challenging to have their parents rely on them when their peers are really working on kind of becoming independent from their parents, right? So as a refugee youth who maybe understands the language better, you might be put in this position where it's hard for you to kind of separate as much as you see your peers doing, because your parents really are reliant on your language skills. So one thing that schools can do to help is to make sure that there are translation services available whenever possible, so that we can avoid placing students in these adult roles and let them maintain as much as and those kind of developmentally appropriate roles. It's also important to consider the negative impacts of identity-based harassment for refugee students. Obviously, identity-based harassment is challenging and damaging for anyone. But as we noted on the last slide, positive connections to prior cultural identities can really serve as an important source of strength for refugee students. But when students are targeted for harassment based on their cultural identities, they may start pulling away from those identities. So not only is that identity-based harassment a harmful experience, as I said, it's harmful for any student, but it can strip away really important sources of support that could otherwise buffer refugee students from adversity. So it kind of has a double-edged effect for refugee youth. And as adults, that really means it's critical that we step in to address identity-based harassment when we see it happening. So I mentioned before that students are developing multiple aspects to their identities, and I'm just going to cover a couple of quick points here before we'll get to Cassidy and a little bit more of an interactive activity for us. But I did just want to make sure to highlight that there are a couple of things to think about, because as we know, we all have multiple identities. And so two important concepts here are identity salience and identity coherence. So identity salience really just refers to how central a particular identity is for a young person relative to the other identities they hold. And as adults, what we really need to keep in mind is that we don't always know, we're probably not always able to accurately guess which identities, A, youth even hold, but B, which of the identities are most central to them in a particular situation. So it really requires us to listen and kind of learn and pay attention to students and better understand their identities. Identity coherence refers to whether a young person feels like their various identities are integrated. So in other words, do they feel like they can be their authentic self in all settings? Or do they feel like they have kind of contradicting identities depending on where they are or who they're with? Like I said, our identities might have different centrality, and that's kind of normal. But what we're talking about here is kind of this idea of, I just can't be myself in a certain setting. Not that I'm just having a different part of me be more central, but really like, I can't actually be who I really authentically feel like I am in some settings. And that can be particularly complex for refugee students because they might be adapting to cultural norms at a different pace than their parents, and that can create some tensions at home as well that are important for us to keep in mind as we work to support students and their families. So speaking of supporting students and their families, we know y'all are doing it. We just talked last week about how you have such a critical role in promoting resilience for refugee students and their families. So we're going to pause now and give you all a chance to share what are some strategies that you have used to learn more about refugee students' identities so that we don't go based on assumptions. So I'll pause briefly before turning it over to Cassidy so that folks can share some of the examples of, it could be a strategy you've used, a strategy that you've seen someone else use, but we really want to give folks ideas to walk away with of what is something they could do differently if they want to kind of add an additional tool to their toolkit. So I see getting to know you surveys, personal narratives at the beginning of the year. We'll give a couple of seconds for some more folks to share. An I am poem. And if you have links to any specific things that you like to use, feel free to pop those in the chat as well. So I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to Cassidy, but please do continue to share your strategies so that your colleagues can kind of get ideas sparked through those ideas.
Thanks, Brandon. Okay, so now that we've spent some time thinking about the experiences of refugee youth as they're working to establish their identities, let's keep in mind that you all play a really, really key role in serving as a buffer to reduce the stress that they're feeling. Like we talked about during the last session, supportive buffers can be the difference between a child perceiving an event as traumatic or helping them to respond with resilience. And with that important role in mind, we're going to spend some time thinking about how our own identities might influence our work with refugee students and families in our next activity. So, all right. One of the most important ways our identities influence our work with refugee students and families is through implicit bias. Implicit bias sounds bad, but I want to assure you that we're not here to criticize anyone. And the truth is that we all have biases. It might be better if we really just call them automatic thoughts, because that's really what they are. They're thoughts that just pop into our head almost immediately and automatically. We'll take a look at this brief video from the National Education Association that explains a bit more about implicit bias, and feel free to pop in any reactions that you might have to the video in the chat.
You may have heard the term implicit bias before, but what is it? Why does it happen? And how does it show up in our lives and world? Implicit biases are essentially thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Basically, mental shortcuts and judgments that occur in both positive and negative ways, some of which you might not even agree with. These biases stem from very normal mental functioning and exposure to things like the media, news, our education, and any type of experience with others. Think of these experiences as having an invisible effect on how your brain gets wired, something you are unaware of as it happens. This wiring creates mental associations that lead to biases because of the cycle of socialization. Consider this. When you hear peanut butter, your mind likely goes to jelly. Despite peanut butter and jelly being completely independent from one another, we all associate them in this way because we constantly see them represented together. We all have associations like this that we haven't intentionally created. But it's important to understand that not all of our implicit biases are as innocuous as peanut butter and jelly. These biases too often shape the language we use and the ways we interact with others, based on race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other cultural identities. This cycle of socialization can lead to microaggressions, stereotypes, discrimination, and even violence. These unintended sentiments that are embedded within the cycle socialization are built around a culture of white supremacy that we must continually acknowledge, confront, dismantle, and disrupt to advance the work of racial and social justice. We know that to advance racial and social justice, we must be willing to challenge our implicit bias by confronting the biases in our own lives. Just as our brains have been wired to create these unjust associations, it can also be unwired as you confront and disrupt the process by questioning your assumptions, educating yourself, and taking a stand. At the NEA, we challenge you to stay engaged, dig deeper, and ignite your passion for racial and social justice in our world, communities, and schools.
So as we saw in the video, these automatic thoughts are based in the many different experiences that we've had, as well as what we hear and see in the world around us. The experiences we have and the messages we receive are likely influenced by our identities. So we're going to spend the next few minutes reflecting on our identities using the wheel that Brandon just popped in the chat. So you'll see the social identity wheel on this slide to the left, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It includes several different categories of identities, such as age, gender, and legal status, just to name a few. Of course, it's not a comprehensive list as well, just some examples. And for some people, you might not have given much thought to some of these categories, but we'd like you to spend the next 5 minutes kind of really digging deep and doing just that. If we had more time, we might ask you to put primary identities for each category in the inner red portion and secondary identities on the outside. But for now, it's probably enough to just spend some time thinking about them more broadly. So we're going to leave this slide up for the next 5 or so minutes so that you can see the categories. But Brandon also put a link in the chat so you can download the handout if you'd like and be able to use it that way. So I will go ahead and give us some little background music for the next probably until about 3:40 and go ahead and take some time to think about this. So I'll bring us all back. Thanks everyone for participating in that exercise. I noticed in the chat, Sarah said, some of these identities still aren't clearly formed, and Brandon said that identities can absolutely change in different spaces. I think that's just an important reminder that identities really are fluid depending on where you are, how old you are, they can change over time. So definitely not always static, and it's important to remember that. Okay, so now we're going to transition to using a Jamboard. Once again, if you were with us last time, this might feel a little familiar. I'm popping the link in the chat right now. Feel free to let me know if there's any problems with that. But just for a quick refresher, you'll navigate between the Jamboards using the arrows at the top of the screen. I think this time there are about 7 or 9 Jamboards to move through. So just keep that in mind. You'll be moving with those arrows. If you want to add a sticky note, you can do that using the panel on the left. Type out your comment, hit save, and drag it wherever you'd like on the Jamboard. Okay. Now we have a list of questions that we'd like to also take some time to work through. You'll see them at the top of every Jamboard. Now, we don't expect you to all get through everything in just a few minutes. So we'd like, if you have a birthday starting in January through June, so the first half of the year, please start with those questions at the top or one on the Jamboard and work your way down. And if you have a birthday in July through December, start at the back of the Jamboard and work your way the other way. So go ahead and take a moment to add a note with your response to the question on that board. We'll take a few minutes to let everyone work through the boards, and I'll keep this slide up until it's time to share out. Oh, and yes, Brandon, thank you for mentioning. Slide 9 will come later, so just 1 through 8.
I'm also just going to give a quick logistical note, which is for some reason, Jamboard sticks every single note in the very same spot. So if you think about it, once you put yours in, you might want to slide it over somewhere else so it doesn't end up covering somebody else's, but we'll try and go in and slide things around too.
Now, let's take a look and see what folks are putting. So for which identity are you the most proud of? We've got mother a lot, which is beautiful. Education, being an African American, being progressive despite having been raised in a politically conservative family. I don't have a specific identity, but I'm proud to think, I'm proud to have, generally, I think people are proud of the identities that place them in a larger path of historical development. Identity is the most important to you. We have religion, faith, mother again, professional Jewish women, education, being a teacher, love that. Mother, sister, grandmother, wife, mom. All right, which identity is the least important to you? Religion, age, sports teams, ethnicity, books, movies. What do you struggle the most with? My age. Political, we see some religion up here. Those that I can't control. Yeah. For which identity do you feel that you receive power the most often? Race and educational background, language, race and socioeconomic status, yep, religion and health, definitely education. Which identity do you experience oppression the most often? Being a Muslim American, Muslim, ability, status, gender, height, yep, race and age. What do you notice first about other people? Gender, race, age, ethnicity. Used to be gender, but now ethnicity, since I work with students from many different cultures. Another great example of how that can change. Yep. Are they welcoming and friendly? Which identities do you think are the most important? Yeah. Gender, language, yep. Nationality, country of origin. Yeah. This is all great. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, I will pull the slides back up. Thank you all for sharing. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share verbally before we move to the next section?
I'm curious, and you don't have to share, but welcome to share. If there were any of these questions that were more difficult for folks to answer than others.
I think it was difficult to answer the question about what do you struggle the most with.
I feel like I'm struggling to answer what I'm the most proud of. It feels a bit strange to be more proud of one identity than another, but I guess for some people that's an easier question to answer.
Well,
Did anyone have...
Oh,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, did anybody have an experience where you're like, oh, never really thought of the answer to this question before? Or are these all questions that you might have thought of at some point?
I've had a hard time thinking of ways that I'm oppressed as an educated white woman. The only time I really feel that way is in circles of men, but even then I've got the skills to be able to navigate a lot of those spaces. So compared to my refugee students, I don't think I experienced oppression at all.
Yeah, I think that is one of the important things for us also about kind of our identities, and the fact that so many of them are social is kind of like what you were saying, taking in our experiences within the context of what we see other people going through as well, which is so important when it comes to cultivating empathy and really being able to try and ensure that students and their families feel seen and heard. So we already probably started addressing what we're going to talk about on this next slide through the kind of thought processes in the Jamboard and the discussion that we just had. But it's really important to realize that identities are often associated with power or marginalization, and that relationship can change in different contexts. So an identity that might feel powerful in some contexts might feel more marginalized in other contexts around other people. So I want to recognize that that might be different, but the image on the right reflects power dynamics for different identities that are pretty broadly applicable in the United States. So again, it can vary depending on the context that you're in, but kind of at a societal level, what is represented in this wheel of power and privilege is generally true for folks in the United States. And this image is intended to align with a concept, which some of you may have heard already, intersectionality, which was originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a Black feminist legal scholar. And this concept of intersectionality was originally developed to help highlight the double bind that Black women in the United States face with respect to experiencing both racial and gender prejudice. But the concept has since been expanded to help folks think about the ways in which individuals might experience multiple forms of identity-based prejudice. So that's why you see there's a lot of different kind of sections to this wheel, because we do have multiple identities. So I want to give folks a moment to just kind of take in this wheel. Some of you may have seen it already. For some of you, it might be newer. Hopefully, so this is one that gets shared a lot, but I also recognize that the handwriting font may be a little tricky to read. So take a moment to think about kind of the identities that you hold and where on that kind of section of power to marginalization your identities are. You might think about kind of your key identities, or you might think about the identities that become most central for you when you're working in schools, but just kind of thinking about where you're experiencing power and marginalization in your own identities. And then we'll take a couple of moments to let folks also think about, what do you see? How do you see the refugee students and families that you work with represented within this wheel of power and privilege? By the way, while we're soaking this one in, I do want to pause and just say, Tamika, I love your comment, that it was interesting to see what someone's oppression was another person's way they received power. I see some other folks have kind of added on their kind of thumbs up or 100 agreement to that. But if you had anything you wanted to share about that, either in the chat or if you want to unmute and just kind of share your thoughts behind that. It seems to have resonated with some folks. Okay, well, in the interest of time and getting through everything, I will say that you will get all these slides, so feel free to kind of use them as you see fit. Maybe you want to dig in a little bit more with some of these activities or share them with some of your colleagues. But now I really want to kind of pause, and this is probably related to what folks were already sharing and what people have already started thinking about. But what is something that you're going to take away from this discussion today? What struck you? Could be something that you're like, I knew this, and it was really reinforced for me how important that is based on the discussion today. It could be something new that you hadn't really thought of before. But what is something that has just struck you today in engaging with this material? All right, so I see Sarah saying that the wheel is really a great kind of visualization of the power difference between us and our students, and kind of seeing how we might align with them in some identities and be different in others. I'll also point out that so for the for refugee families and students, another thing that has probably happened to them with respect to this wheel of power and privilege, they might have been somewhere closer to the middle in some situations prior to coming to the US. And their situation might have changed when they came, and that could be vice versa too. They may have felt more marginalized in some ways in the country that they left than they feel now. So, that's just another example of the ways in which our identities can shift based on context, and how those identities, because they're attached to power and privilege, that can also change. Okay, so please keep your thoughts coming, because I think they're sparking thoughts for your colleagues as well, but we are going to keep it moving because this last point is going to be brief, but important, and we're going to cover it some more next week. So we're going to end today's session with a brief discussion of secondary traumatic stress. So many of you have probably heard this term, and it basically refers to the emotional distress that results when an individual hears about or witnesses the traumatic experiences of another person or group of people. And it's important to note that staff who are from marginalized communities or who have experienced trauma themselves may be especially impacted by the traumas of students and their families. And like I said, we're going to talk more about secondary traumatic stress next week as we talk about what are some strategies that schools can implement to better support refugee students and their families. But today I want to direct you to this resource that we're going to pop this link into the chat. And hopefully that worked. I seem to have put some other funny little message in there, but there's a link that you can go to. It's a handout about secondary traumatic stress. It has more information about what secondary traumatic stress is, but it also has an assessment and a template for you to develop your own personal plan of what you will do to address any secondary traumatic stress that you might experience. And we can move on to the next slide. And what I will highlight on this slide really is that towards the end of that handout, if you take a look at it, you start getting to things related to what the school can do. And so you'll see some examples on this slide right here. But I really encourage you to get to that section of the handout before we meet again next week, because it starts really bringing up some of the things that schools can be doing to address the secondary traumatic stress of staff, which is really going to be a critical piece to making sure that we can also create safe environments for refugee students and their families. So again, we're not covering it very long today, and we're really just starting it today because given all of the kind of heavy and meaningful topics that we've covered today, I wanted to make sure to leave you with this resource that has some examples, ideas, and can kind of further our thinking. And on that note, we are going to wrap up. And so we want to ask you to go back to the Jamboard, to the very last slide of the Jamboard, and think about what is something that you plan to do differently as a result of what you learned today. Again, it could be something personal about your own exploration, could be something that you plan to do with students or families, could be a conversation you plan to have with a colleague. Connie, thanks for asking. So this is not like homework, but if you click on that link that says safesupportivelearning.ed.gov, that is a handout about secondary traumatic stress. And in particular, it's towards the very end of it. So I think it's like 9 pages or something. So you might want to scroll down to page like 7, where it starts talking about schools and what schools are doing. I'd encourage everyone to just kind of take a look at that before we meet again next week. But for right now, hope everybody's on the Jamboard, putting your own kind of personal commitment of what is something you plan to do this week or next week, since some of you are off tomorrow. And again, it's intended, we're asking you to do this on the Jamboard because we want other people to see it. And we want to kind of spark ideas for folks about what we can be doing to apply what we've learned.
As you all are posting, I just want to thank Brandon and Cassidy for joining us today and for leading us in our learning and for sharing your expertise. In the chat, I put the session evaluation link, which is also the link to apply for Act 48. And we hope that you join us for the final session in this webinar series with Brandon and Cassidy next Thursday, November 16th from 3 to 4 p.m. Thank you all again.